There's a bloodline in the mountains of central Anatolia that should not exist, not according to modern genetics, not according to anything we understand about how human populations are supposed to work. But it does exist, and when scientists finally traced it back to its source, they found something that made them question whether we've been telling the story of civilization wrong this entire time, because this wasn't just an ancient kingdom. It was a laboratory, and the experiments ran for 3,000 years. In 1961, a farmer in Cappadocia broke through the floor of his basement and fell into darkness. When they pulled him out and shined lights down into that hole, they found a city. Not ruins, a city, carved 8 levels deep into volcanic rock. Room after room after room, spiraling down into the earth like a stone hive. Ventilation shafts, water systems, spaces for 20,000 people to live underground for months at a time. And this wasn't the only one. They found dozens, entire networks of subterranean cities connected by tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the surface. Cities that were old when Rome was young. But here's what they don't tell you in the documentaries. Here's what makes archaeologists go quiet when you press them. These cities weren't built for war. They weren't built for storage or ceremony or any of the usual reasons ancient people did massive construction projects. They were built for something else, something that required isolation, complete isolation, because when you dig through the records, when you trace the genetic data back, you find that the people who lived in these cities didn't just hide from the world. They separated from it entirely. Generation after generation, century after century, living in controlled populations beneath the earth. And their DNA started to change, the kingdom of Cappadocia. That's what the Greeks called it when they finally encountered these people. A civilization that had been breeding itself in the dark for longer than anyone could measure. And by the time the surface world found them, they had become something different, not quite separate enough to be another species, but different enough that modern geneticists call them an outlier population, a branch of humanity that went somewhere else, somewhere we didn't follow until now, until we started asking why. The genetic markers show up in blood tests across Turkey, Armenia, and parts of Greece. Specific mutations that appear nowhere else on Earth. Mutations that control bone density, eye sensitivity to low light, and something the researchers won't talk about publicly. Something about neural pathway development. The ability to process information differently when you spend your entire childhood in near darkness. The Cappadocian genome isn't just unique, it's optimized. Optimized for a life that no human should have been living. But here's where it gets darker. These people didn't hide underground because of invaders. They went down there by choice. Long before the Hittites, long before any empire we have records of, there was a culture in Anatolia that believed something we've forgotten. They believed that the surface world was contamination, that sunlight and open air carried corruption into the bloodline, that the only way to preserve human purity was to seal yourself away from it, to live in stone, to breathe recycled air, to marry only within your own tunnels. And they did this for so long that their bodies adapted. The underground cities aren't villages, they're breeding chambers. Every layout, every design choice, every carved room serves one purpose: population control, genetic isolation. The ventilation systems don't just bring air, they separate sectors. Different families in different levels, breathing different air, kept apart by stone and custom, and something close to religious law. The water channels don't just carry drinking water, they mark boundaries. You don't cross into another family's water supply, you don't mix, you don't contaminate the line, and the most disturbing part, it worked. When geneticists mapped the family trees using DNA samples from modern descendants, they found something that shouldn't be possible. They found genetic diversity that's too low, populations that stayed separated for so long in such small numbers that they should have collapsed from inbreeding centuries ago, but they didn't collapse. They thrived because someone was managing it, someone was deciding who bred with who, someone was tracking bloodlines with a precision that wouldn't be matched until computer databases in the Bronze Age. In the dark, and they left no written records of how they did it. There are chambers in the deepest levels that archaeologists won't photograph, not because they're forbidden, because they don't know what to call them. Rooms carved with surgical precision, lined with channels that once held something, not water, not oil, something else. The stone is stained in patterns that suggest repeated use over centuries, patterns that circle around central platforms. Platforms with grooves, grooves that fit a human body, a small human body, and there are dozens of these rooms in every city, always on the lowest level, always near the ventilation shafts. The locals in Cappadocia don't like talking about the old families, the ones whose ancestry goes back before records, before names. There's a superstition that still exists in the mountain villages. They call it the choosing. It's not written down anywhere. It's passed mother to daughter, father to son, in whispers. The choosing was how they decided which children stayed, and which children went to the deep rooms, because not every child born in those tunnels grew up in those tunnels. Some of them were marked for something the tradition calls purification. And when the Greeks finally conquered the region and tried to document what they found, they wrote about religious practices they couldn't understand, practices involving bloodletting, practices involving children who were brought to the lowest chambers and kept there until they changed. Changed how? The Greek texts are vague, deliberately vague, but they mention physical differences. Children who emerged from the deep chambers with altered features, larger eyes, thinner bones, skin that couldn't tolerate sunlight. The Greeks thought it was sorcery. We know now it was something worse. It was selective breeding taken to its absolute extreme. It was genetic modification before anyone knew what genes were, and it worked because they had time. Generations upon generations of time, and a willingness to do what had to be done to keep the bloodline pure. Modern geneticists found something in the Cappadocian genome that they call a bottleneck signature. It's evidence of a population that was reduced to an extremely small number of breeding individuals at some point in history, so small that it should have caused genetic collapse. But the Cappadocian bottleneck is different. It happened multiple times, deliberately, over and over across centuries. Someone was creating these bottlenecks on purpose, culling the population down to specific bloodlines, then allowing it to expand again, then culling it again. A genetic rhythm, a breeding program that spanned 1,000 years, and we only found the evidence because their descendants are still alive, still carrying those markers, still living in the villages above the tunnels their ancestors carved. In 2003, a research team from Ankara University brought ground-penetrating radar to Derinkuyu, the largest of the underground cities. They were mapping the known levels, standard archaeological work. But the radar showed something that wasn't on any map: deeper chambers, sealed chambers, spaces that had been deliberately filled with rubble and volcanic rock sometime in antiquity, spaces that someone wanted to make sure stayed buried. The Turkish government denied permits to excavate. They still do, but in 2011, a local crew working on water pipes broke through into one of those sealed sections by accident, and what they found got the site shut down for 6 months. The official report says they found evidence of mass burial. That's the public story. Mass burial in a sealed chamber suggests plague or disaster. Standard procedure. But 3 members of that excavation crew left archaeology entirely after that dig. One of them talked to a journalist years later, off the record. He described something else. He described skeletons that were arranged, not buried in the chaos of emergency, arranged in circles, layer after layer of them going down into the floor. Children's skeletons in the center, adult skeletons radiating outward, and every single skull showing evidence of deliberate modification, cranial deformation, trepanation, marks that suggested someone had been opening these skulls while the people were still alive. The Cappadocians weren't just isolating their gene pool. They were trying to shape it, physically shape it. They understood something about heredity that wouldn't be formally discovered until Mendel started breeding peas in the 1800. They knew that traits passed from parent to child. They knew that certain families carried certain features, and they knew that if you controlled who bred with who, if you did it long enough, if you were willing to make sacrifices, you could create something new. Something that had never existed before, a subspecies adapted to life underground, a human variant built for darkness. And here's what keeps me awake. It almost worked. The genetic evidence suggests they were succeeding. The mutations were spreading. The adaptations were taking hold. Whatever they were trying to create was actually forming in the DNA of those populations. And then suddenly, around 800 BC, the underground cities were abandoned. All of them, at roughly the same time, the populations came to the surface and dispersed, and within a few generations, they'd mixed with surface populations enough that the concentrated genetic experiment fell apart. The bloodlines diluted, the adaptations faded into statistical noise, but they didn't disappear entirely. They're still there, waiting in the genome, and if you know what to look for, you can still find them. In the eyes of shepherds in central Turkey, in the bone density of certain families in Armenia, in children who are born seeing better in darkness than they do in light. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? If you discovered your ancestors spent 3,000 years in the dark, breeding themselves into something else, would you want to know what they were trying to become? Because that's the question that haunts the research. Why would any group of people choose this? Why would you take your children underground and keep them there for generation after generation? The standard archaeological answer is defense, protection from invaders, but that doesn't explain the genetic program. That doesn't explain the selective breeding. That doesn't explain why they kept doing it for centuries after any surface threat had passed. There's another theory, one that most academics won't touch because it sounds too much like ancient astronaut nonsense, but the theory exists and it has evidence. The Cappadocian underground cities align with similar structures across the ancient world. Malta, China, Dirinku, and its sister cities form geometric patterns when you map them from above, patterns that suggest coordination, shared knowledge, a single blueprint being executed across hundreds of miles by populations that supposedly never had contact. And in every one of these sites, you find the same thing, evidence of long-term habitation, evidence of genetic isolation, and evidence of something the researchers call transformation chambers, rooms designed for ritual. Rooms designed for changing people. There's a theory that these weren't cities at all. They were incubators, part of a global project to create adapted human variants, not for war, not for survival, for something else. For living on a planet that was becoming uninhabitable because there's geological evidence that around the time these cities were being carved, the climate was changing rapidly, solar radiation was increasing, surface temperatures were becoming extreme, and someone, somewhere, decided that the solution wasn't to change the environment. It was to change humanity, to create versions of us that could survive in conditions we weren't built for. Underground, in darkness, breathing thin air, living in stone, and the Cappadocians were just one experiment, one branch of the program. There were others. In Malta, They found elongated skulls in underground temples. In China, they found sealed tunnel systems with evidence of populations that lived without sunlight for centuries. In South America, they found high-altitude cities where people developed lung capacity and blood oxygen levels that shouldn't be possible. Different adaptations, different mutations, all happening at the same time, all suggesting coordination, all suggesting that someone somewhere was trying to future-proof the human species, and they were willing to do anything to make it work. In 2019, a genetics lab in Istanbul published a study that got almost no mainstream attention. They'd been sampling DNA from villages around Cappadocia for years, looking for those signature mutations. And they found something unexpected. The mutations aren't recessive. They're not fading out through interbreeding like everyone assumed. They're dormant, sitting in the genome, inactive, waiting. And in certain environmental conditions, they activate. Children born to families with Cappadocian ancestry, when raised in low-light conditions, when kept in enclosed spaces during critical development periods, start expressing traits their ancestors had. Enhanced night vision, altered bone growth, increased tolerance for poor air quality. The modifications are still in the code. They never left. They're just sleeping. The study was quietly pulled from publication. The lead researcher left the university. No explanation, no follow-up, but the data leaked. And now there are communities, small communities in the remote parts of Turkey and Armenia, where people know about this, where they've started testing it, families who deliberately keep their children in low-light environments during early development, traditional practices that they claim go back generations, but that look disturbingly like the old ways. The ways from the tunnels. They're not doing it for science. They're doing it because they believe something's coming. Something that will make the surface world unlivable again. And when it does, they want their children to be ready. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented behavior. There are villages where children are kept indoors for the first 5 years of life, where families still practice marriage within strict bloodline boundaries, where they track ancestry with a precision that seems obsessive until you realize what they're tracking. They're maintaining the genetic reservoir, keeping the modifications alive in the population, waiting for the day when they'll need them again. And when you talk to these people, when you ask them why, they don't talk about climate change or environmental collapse. They talk about the cycle. They talk about the old times. The times when their ancestors went underground and stayed there because the sky was burning. And they say it's going to happen again. They say it's already starting. The archaeological establishment ignores this. The genetic research community won't touch it. But there are researchers, independent researchers, who have been tracking these communities for years. And they found something disturbing. The number of children being born with spontaneous expression of Cappadocian traits is increasing, not in the traditional communities, everywhere. Random families across Turkey, Armenia, even in diaspora populations in Europe and America, are reporting children born with unusual light sensitivity, children who develop better in low-light conditions than in bright ones, children whose bone structure develops in ways that doctors can't explain. The traits are reappearing without environmental trigger, without selective breeding, as if something in the genome is waking up on its own, as if the modifications are trying to resurface. The deepest level of Derinkuyu has never been fully excavated. They've mapped it with radar. They know it's there, but they won't dig it out. The official reason is structural instability. The real reason is what the radar shows. There's a chamber down there larger than anything on the upper levels, a chamber with geometric precision that shouldn't exist in Bronze Age construction, and inside that chamber there are objects. Metal objects, technology that doesn't match the timeline, The radar can't tell them what the objects are, only that they are there, arranged in patterns, waiting in the dark. The Cappadocians didn't just breed themselves into something new. They left something behind, instructions, a genetic inheritance that's still active in the bloodlines, still waiting for the right conditions to fully express. And those conditions are coming: climate collapse, resource depletion. The same pressures that drove them underground 3,000 years ago are building again, and somewhere in the genome of their descendants, the old adaptations are stirring, preparing for a world where the surface becomes uninhabitable, where the only way to survive is to go back down, back into the stone, back into the dark. There are people who believe the Cappadocians knew this would happen, that they weren't responding to their own climate crisis. They were preparing for ours, that the entire genetic program was designed with a timeline that spans millennia, a slow burn modification to the human species that would lie dormant until it was needed. And now it's needed. Now the traits are reappearing. Now children are being born with eyes that work better in darkness than in light, with bones that handle confined spaces better than open air, with lungs that process thin oxygen more efficiently than their parents' generation. The modifications are coming back online, and nobody's controlling them anymore. The kingdom that rewrote genetics through its traditions didn't die when it came to the surface. It went to sleep. It spread itself across the population and waited. And now, 3,000 years later, it's waking up, in the blood of people who don't know their ancestry, in children who can't explain why they're different, in genetic markers that are activating without cause. The Cappadocians aren't ancient history. They're a blueprint, a survival protocol encoded in human DNA, and it's executing right now, in real time, in bloodlines across the world. The experiment never ended. It just went quiet, and now it's speaking again, in the only language it knows, in flesh, in bone, in the darkness behind your eyes when you close them and wonder what you might become.